Hello and happy Monday. On this mm, so Monday in the Midwest, I hope you're having a good Monday wherever you are in the globe. We're going to be talking about 1099. And so our question comes from Howard G. And Howard asks, so I am thinking about becoming a 1099 for a colleague that I've had in the past that has their own business. What are some do's and don'ts that you can share around doing that? Well, Howard, that's a really great question. So, Howard, this is where you are actually not a full-time employee. You are working with someone and you're not part-time employee. You're another professional that is doing work for someone under your business moniker. Under their business moniker, you're supporting them and their work. Now, with that, there are some do's and don'ts that are really important. There's actually quite a few, but let's talk around boundary setting. One, you need to make sure that you have a clear contract that is not just a written contract, but you've also discussed the contract, meaning that person needs to provide you with a contract that you will discuss with them around what it looks like to work together. What does it actually look like? What are the expectations? Make sure you have that conversation so that later on there are no hard feelings. So that's one. Two, recognize that the client that you are working with is their client, is not your client. They don't fall. See, this is live. So, there's like phones ringing and all kinds of stuff happening live. All right, so make sure that you understand that it's their client and not your client. And so that means that it's their expectations of that client. That's really important. The other thing that is a bit of a frustration that needs to be set clear in the contract is around intellectual property. Now, why do I say that's a bit of frustration? So there's two things that happen in terms of intellectual property. So let's say the person that you are working for, Howard, that you are providing your services, expects you to use your intellectual property to provide that service. That's why they've contracted you out. It needs to be really clear in the contract that it is your intellectual property and that it doesn't belong to them. Because here's what happens in a lot of these contracts. Someone will have you sign a contract that basically says that they have the rights to your intellectual property, that they get to not only use your intellectual property after this gig, but they get to claim it as their own because you did it under their moniker or you used it under their moniker. And that's really frustrating if you have a framework or a system that you're using for their client that you may have developed before this client, and it's your framework or system. But if you use it, it now all of a sudden becomes this other company's framework or system. So with that, you need to have it clearly stated in the contract what happens to intellectual property. That if you're using your intellectual property, that it remains your intellectual property. Now, there's some contracts that say, well, if you created this intellectual property doing this work with my client, then therefore I get to keep this intellectual property. You can if you want to do that. If you feel like, yeah, sure, that's fine. But if you don't, you need to be very clear and have it stated that whatever you've created, you're taking with you because it's still your intellectual property. This is different than an employee contract. And I think what happens is a lot of people will use an employee contract for their 1099 contract. Not the same thing. So there needs to be a deeper conversation around intellectual property, because if I'm an employee of your company, meaning I'm a full-time or part-time employee, you do have rights to the intellectual property because I did it under the time that you paid me as a full-time or part-time employee. What's different as a 1099 is that I may not have created that during the time that I was doing the work for your client. I may have created that at a different time with a different client and just thought, oh, that would be good to use with your client. So it's a great area in terms of when the creation of it happened. And so you need to make sure that your contract really states what happens to intellectual property. Now, let's say you're working with someone, Howard, that says, well, bottom line is I feel like you created it during the time that you worked with my client. So I feel like I have ownership of that intellectual property because I'm paying you for that time, right? Or I'm paying you for this project. That being said, if you feel comfortable with that after you've checked with your lawyers, I am not a lawyer. I don't even play one on TV. So after you've checked with your lawyers to make sure that this is beneficial to you and beneficial to that other person, then you can go ahead and sign that contract and give them that intellectual property. But if you feel really strongly that whatever you create should remain with you and belong to you, then you need to reconsider whether or not to agree to do that gig, agree to do that project. And that's a non-negotiable, but you need to make sure that you've set that boundary in advance because there's a lot of hurt feelings when that happens. So now let's talk about the reverse. Let's say you don't have to create the intellectual property. Let's say the person that's hiring you for the service, they will be using their intellectual property. Now, it also needs to be clearly stated in the contract whether or not you are allowed to use their intellectual property after you leave the program or service or project. I'm of the mind, this is just me, if you're using my intellectual property, then unless it is stated in the contract, you cannot use that intellectual property with other clients. I think that's fair. The same way, if you created that intellectual property while you were working on my project, I'm not going to take that and use that with other clients without your permission or consent. Now, that's just me. Some people will have a different feeling about that. Some people will say, hey, the work that I'm doing, my frameworks, my work is something that I want to spread through the universe. So I want you to use that intellectual property with other clients, but I want you to give credit because I'm trademarking this, or it's, my intellectual property. So if you're using it, I want you to give credit or want you to pay a licensing fee or whatever the case may be. Make sure that's clearly stated, that those intentions are understood. And you, as a 1099, you understand when it is okay to use that intellectual property and when it is not okay to use that intellectual property. Make sure you understand those boundaries. And because you're using it with their client and they're opening sort of their vault to share their intellectual property with you, does not give you the right to turn around and use it with someone else if you don't have permission to do so. So please keep that in mind. The same way you wouldn't want them to turn around and do that to you, you don't want to do that to them. It's really important. I have benched for people that their intellectual property I cannot use with other clients, and I don't. I just go, okay, that's cool. I'm only using it with your clients, and then my clients or other people's clients, I do not use that work. I don't discuss that work with them. And that's a clear boundary. I have some people who are like, I would love for you to use my intellectual property with other clients. And sometimes I'm like, oh, that's great. Thank you for sharing that. And sometimes I'll say, oh, that's great. The work that I do with my clients, this would not fit into that. And so I will not be using thank you for sharing it with me, but I will not be using it. I kind of have a very much, this is your intellectual property. I will not use it without your consent with other clients philosophy. And it's very reciprocal for me because I have that same expectation for people that I allow them to use my intellectual property as well, that to not use it unless there is consent. Again, it's about setting those boundaries, but more important, Howard, it's about having the conversation because this can look different in every contract. So it's really important that you don't just get a contract and sign it, that you get a contract and have a conversation. So let's say you're benching for someone who does not think to have that conversation with you. You can simply say, thank you so much for sending me this contract. I would love to take some time to talk to you about the contract and have a discussion. I will tell you, I've learned that from personal experience where I did not have conversations with people about what the expectations were, and it ended badly because we did not set clear boundaries and clear expectations. And so on both sides. And so now my philosophy is have clear expectations, have clear boundaries, have clear conversations of what the expectation is and the consequences of not meeting those expectations. I think that's really important for both sides, the person that is the brand owner and the person that is the 1099 supporting that brand. And so I hope that answers your question. That was a little bit long-winded today. I will see you next week with a new question. Bye for now.